Hello and welcome. My name is Patrick Machayo, and thank you very much for joining me once again in this ongoing conversation about democracy, governance, leadership, institutional legitimacy, and the growing crisis of trust in America. This is episode 5, the final episode in our 5-part series titled The Crisis of Trust in America: Leadership, Democracy, Dishonesty, and the Strain on American Institutions. In episode 1, we discussed how many Americans gradually began losing faith in institutions through repeated experiences involving war fatigue, financial crises, political scandals, institutional contradictions, and emotional exhaustion. In episode 2, we explored media fragmentation, social media outrage, misinformation, and the collapse of shared reality in modern America. In episode 3, we examined science, COVID, vaccines, public health, and the growing distrust surrounding expertise itself. And in episode 4, we discussed corruption, elite privilege, unequal accountability, and why many ordinary Americans increasingly believe the system itself is rigged against them. Today, in our final episode, we are going to discuss perhaps the most important question of all. Can America rebuild trust? Can democratic legitimacy be restored? Can institutions recover credibility? Can Americans reconnect socially and emotionally enough to sustain healthy democracy moving forward? And honestly, despite everything we have discussed throughout this series, my answer is yes. But rebuilding trust will require honesty, humility, accountability, and emotional maturity from both institutions and citizens alike. This question matters deeply to me because so much of my work has focused on democratic strain, institutional legitimacy, and the emotional condition of American society itself. Many of these themes became central to my books America at 250, Democracy at Risk, and America Under Strain, the unfinished work of American democracy. While writing those books, I kept returning to one uncomfortable realization. America's greatest challenges today are not simply political or economic. They are emotional, institutional, and psychological simultaneously. And trust sits at the center of all of them, because trust is what allows democratic societies to function peacefully, despite disagreement. Without trust, elections become suspect, institutions become fragile, leadership loses legitimacy, and citizens withdraw emotionally from public life itself. One thing I have learned over time is that trust behaves much like human relationships. It develops slowly. It requires consistency. It depends on honesty. And once damaged repeatedly, rebuilding becomes difficult, sometimes painfully difficult. That is exactly where America finds itself today. Millions of Americans no longer trust government, media, corporations, political leadership, public health institutions, financial systems, social media, and increasingly one another. That last point may be the most dangerous of all, because once citizens stop trusting one another as fellow Americans, democratic culture weakens profoundly. I think many Americans today feel emotionally exhausted by modern public life. Politics feels non-stop. Outrage never ends. Social media amplifies conflict constantly. News cycles move at overwhelming speed. Economic anxiety remains widespread, and many people increasingly feel psychologically overwhelmed. That emotional exhaustion matters enormously, because exhausted societies often become cynical societies, and cynical societies struggle sustaining democratic optimism. I understand some of this frustration personally. I joined the United States Army during the Reagan era, when patriotism and belief in American strength were deeply emphasized. I was brought up believing service to my country was a noble pursuit. I believed institutions broadly functioned in good faith. I believed democracy, despite imperfections, generally corrected itself over time. And honestly, part of me still believes that. But over the years, I also witnessed moments that deeply complicated that optimism. I watched the Iraq War unfold after Americans were told weapons of mass destruction existed. I watched the financial collapse devastate ordinary families. I watched political polarization intensify dramatically. I watched social media fragment public discourse. I watched Americans increasingly lose confidence in leadership and institutions. And like many citizens, I sometimes found myself asking difficult questions. How do we restore trust after repeated disappointment? How do democratic societies recover emotionally after years of polarization and outrage? Those are not simple questions, but I do believe rebuilding trust remains possible. The first step is honesty, not political theater, not slogans, honesty. Citizens can tolerate difficult realities far better than many leaders assume. What damages trust most deeply is often not failure itself, but perceived dishonesty, manipulation, or refusal to acknowledge obvious problems. Americans are remarkably resilient people, but they increasingly want transparency. They want institutions capable of admitting mistakes openly. They want accountability. And honestly, they want leadership that calms emotional chaos rather than constantly intensifying it. That matters enormously because modern America often feels emotionally overstimulated. Everything becomes conflict immediately. Everything becomes outrage. Everything becomes performative. And unfortunately, outrage may generate attention, but it rarely generates trust. I also think rebuilding trust requires restoring some level of shared civic reality again. Americans do not need identical opinions. Democracy has never required uniformity, but societies do require enough shared factual ground to sustain peaceful disagreement. Without that, fragmentation deepens continuously, and social media has made this extraordinarily difficult. Today, millions of Americans consume entirely different informational realities. Different media ecosystems shape different emotional experiences of the country itself. One citizen believes democracy is collapsing because institutions are too weak. Another believes democracy is collapsing because institutions are too powerful. One person believes the media protects democracy. Another believes the media manipulates democracy. One citizen views government intervention as necessary. Another views it as dangerous overreach. Those disagreements are not automatically unhealthy. But once citizens lose all shared trust in facts, institutions, and expertise simultaneously, democratic culture weakens rapidly. That is why media responsibility matters enormously moving forward. And honestly, citizens themselves also carry responsibility. One of the dangers of modern outrage culture is that many people increasingly consume information emotionally rather than thoughtfully. We react instantly. We share instantly. We condemn instantly. But healthy democracy requires patience, complexity, listening, and emotional restraint. That is difficult in algorithm-driven environments, rewarding anger constantly. Still, I believe Americans are capable of rebuilding healthier civic culture, but it will require slowing down emotionally, listening more carefully, rejecting total cynicism, and understanding that disagreement itself is not democratic collapse. I also think rebuilding trust requires reducing economic insecurity. This is extremely important. Citizens struggling constantly with housing costs, healthcare expenses, debt wage stagnation instability, often become more distrustful politically and institutionally over time. Economic stress affects emotional stability, and emotional instability affects democratic stability. One of the things I explored while writing The Weight of the Biden Presidency, Power, Repair, and the Strain of Governance, was how governance itself increasingly operates inside emotionally exhausted societies. Modern presidents inherit tremendous distrust before taking office now. Everything becomes interpreted through suspicion immediately. Even successful policy achievements often fail to generate confidence because distrust itself has become emotionally embedded. That creates enormous strain on leadership. And honestly, no president alone can fully repair social trust. This challenge is broader than individual politicians. It involves culture itself, media ecosystems, technology, economic anxiety, social fragmentation, civic education, public behavior, leadership standards, institutional transparency. All of these factors interact together. I also think America must rebuild local community connections again. One of the themes I explored extensively in my earlier loneliness work is how emotional isolation weakens democratic culture quietly over time. Lonely societies become fragmented societies. Disconnected citizens become more vulnerable to outrage manipulation, conspiracy theories, tribal politics, civic withdrawal. Healthy democracies require social trust, not only institutionally, but personally. People must still feel connected to neighbors, communities, civic life, shared national purpose. And honestly, modern America increasingly struggles with emotional disconnection. Technology connects us constantly while often weakening real human interaction. People communicate all day online, yet frequently feel emotionally isolated. That isolation affects public life more than we realize because emotionally disconnected citizens often stop believing society itself genuinely cares about them. That perception weakens democratic legitimacy too. I also believe educational institutions have an important role moving forward. Not ideological indoctrination, not political conformity, but civic education, critical thinking, media literacy, historical understanding, emotional maturity. Citizens must learn how democracy actually functions and why democratic culture requires compromise, patience, and shared responsibility. Without civic understanding, outrage becomes easier to manipulate politically. Another issue America must confront honestly is leadership ethics. Citizens increasingly want leaders who appear competent, stable, accountable, emotionally disciplined, ethically serious. And honestly, Americans are exhausted by non-stop scandal culture. People want seriousness again, not permanent performance, not endless chaos. Seriousness. Calm leadership matters psychologically during unstable periods. And unfortunately, modern political systems often reward emotional spectacle more than thoughtful governance. That creates dangerous incentives. Still, despite all the polarization and distrust we have discussed throughout this series, I remain hopeful because I have also seen remarkable humanity across America. I have seen teachers helping struggling students, nurses caring compassionately for patients, veterans supporting one another emotionally, volunteers helping elderly citizens' communities, rebuilding after disaster, ordinary Americans showing extraordinary kindness during difficult moments, that humanity still exists. And perhaps that is the most important thing of all, because ultimately, democracy is not sustained by institutions alone. It is sustained by people, by citizens, by shared responsibility, by moral imagination, by empathy. by the willingness to believe the country still remains worth improving rather than abandoning emotionally. That is one reason I continue writing about these issues in books like America at 250, Democracy at Risk, and America Under Strain, the unfinished work of American democracy. Not because I believe America is collapsing permanently, but because I believe democratic societies require constant reflection, self-correction, and emotional honesty. And honestly, I still believe America possesses enormous democratic resilience. But resilience does not mean denial. It means confronting problems honestly, while still believing improvement remains possible. That balance matters enormously. Too much optimism becomes naive. Too much cynicism becomes destructive. Democracy survives somewhere in between. Clear-eyed realism combined with determined hope. As we conclude this 5-part series, I think the central lesson may be this. Trust is one of the most important forms of democratic infrastructure any society possesses. Without trust, institutions weaken, polarization deepens, fear spreads, and fragmentation accelerates. But with trust, societies cooperate, communities stabilize, institutions function, and democracy becomes sustainable, even during disagreement. Throughout this series, we discussed war fatigue, political scandal, media, fragmentation, misinformation, public health distrust, corruption, elite, privilege, loneliness, emotional exhaustion, institutional legitimacy, democratic strain, and underneath all those issues sat one central question. Can Americans still believe in one another and in the democratic experiment itself? I believe the answer is yes. But rebuilding trust will require honesty from leaders, responsibility from institutions, emotional maturity from citizens, and a willingness to rebuild civic culture patiently over time. Trust cannot be rebuilt overnight, but it can be rebuilt. My name is Patrick Machayo, and I want to thank you very much for joining me throughout this entire 5-part series, The Crisis of Trust in America, Leadership, Democracy, Dishonesty, and the Strain on American Institutions. Thank you for engaging in this ongoing conversation about democracy, governance, leadership, institutional legitimacy, emotional fragmentation, and the future of American society. And thank you for allowing me to share some of the same themes explored throughout my books, The Weight of the Biden Presidency, Power, Repair, and the Strain of Governance, America at 250, Democracy at Risk, and America Under Strain, the unfinished work of American democracy.